Today's list will make you uncomfortable, but these images are a part of our story. After all, if we don't face up to the past, how can we really learn from it? From wars to famines and other human atrocities, this video will be a bit heavier than what you're used to. So once you've had a moment to absorb these images, be sure to check out our recent Fun Facts to Brighten Your Day video. That'll help restore your faith in humanity. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 shocking historical photos that were hidden from us. 25. The harsh reality of the Russian famine, 1921 to 1922. Years of turmoil, World War I and the Russian Civil War left Russia's economy in ruins. When a severe drought struck in 1921, it pushed already desperate conditions over the edge. The famine devastated the regions around the Volga and Ural rivers and led to the deaths of an estimated 5 million people. Barefoot and sitting on the ground, these families are only a small fraction of the millions who suffered during the fatal period. 24. The Coalbrook mining disaster of 1960. On January 21, 1960, part of the Coalbrook mine in the Free State, a province of South Africa, collapsed while 1,000 miners were underground. Although hundreds managed to escape, 435 remained trapped. Over the course of 2 weeks, rescuers used sound devices to detect any signs of life in the mine's depths. Sadly, all 435 died. Their bodies were never recovered. 23. The R38 Disaster. The R38 airship, a product of ambitious military engineering, was designed during World War I for long-range patrols over the sea. After the war, the unfinished project was sold to the United States Navy, which hoped to develop airships for its fleet. However, on its fourth test flight, the R-38 suffered a structural failure, exploding midair and crashing into the Humber estuary in northeast England. Of the 49 people on board, only 5 survived. 22. King Leopold II's Congo. This haunting photo is almost too terrible to discuss. It shows Nsala, a man living in the Congo Free State under the brutal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium. In 1904, Nsala failed to meet his daily rubber collection quota. As punishment, the Belgian overseer severed his 5-year-old daughter's hand and foot, later killing both her and his wife. The photo shows Nsala staring at the dismembered remains of his child. Millions of men, women, and children were subjected to forced labor and mutilation during Leopold's reign. 10 million people died. 21. The Scars of Slavery. In 1862, Peter, an enslaved man in Louisiana, endured a brutal whipping that left him scarred for life. Peter was held on a 3,000-acre plantation owned by John and Bridget Lyons, along with more than 40 others. After escaping in March 1863, he made it to Baton Rouge, where he shared how the beating left him bedridden for 2 months. According to some accounts, Peter then went on to enlist in the Union Army's U.S. colored troops, but there are no definitive records to confirm his movements. His ultimate fate remains a mystery. 20. Recovering the Titanic's victims. On April 17, 1912, the McKay Bennett left Nova Scotia to recover the bodies from the Titanic disaster. The ship was chartered by the White Star Line for $500 a day and carried coffins, canvas bags, embalming supplies, and a team of embalmers. Most of the victims did not drown, but died from hypothermia. Their bodies were discovered frozen and grouped together, with a lot of them still wearing life jackets. Of the 1,517 Titanic victims, 337 bodies were recovered. Many are unidentified to this day and were buried under numbered headstones in Halifax Cemetery. 19. The Aftermath of Nagasaki. 15 minutes after the atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, a photographer captured the massive mushroom cloud towering over the devastated city. The bomb claimed between 50 and 100,000 lives. Entire families and neighborhoods were wiped out, making an accurate count impossible. Most of the victims were civilians, children, the elderly, and women. In the years that followed, radiation-related illnesses and birth defects continued to claim lives, and thousands suffered long-term health consequences. 18. The Filipino zoo girl at Coney Island. In 1904, a young Filipino girl was tied to a pole and displayed at the Coney Island Zoo. She was part of a group of 1,300 indigenous Filipinos brought to the U.S. to showcase the country's new control over the Philippines. Placed among monkeys and lizards, she was bound by ropes and treated as an attraction. Visitors even threw peanuts at her. The shocking display was one of many at the time when indigenous people were exploited and put on public display, all under the pretense of promoting colonial power and educating the public. 17. A patient undergoing treatment for mental illness, 1890. In 1890s Germany, mental health treatments often involved methods now considered inhumane. One such practice was known as forced standing, and as you can see, the patients were basically just made to stand in crucifixion-like poses for extended periods. At the time, mental health care in Germany was heavily institutionalized. Patients frequently endured overcrowded and grim conditions, and the prescribed treatments were more focused on containment than care. 16. George McLaurin's fight against segregation. In 1948, George W. McLaurin became the first African American admitted to the University of Oklahoma, where he pursued a doctorate in education. But even after he was accepted, segregation rules didn't go away. McLaurin was made to sit apart from white students, sometimes in separate rooms or areas labeled reserved for colored. The same treatment followed him to the library, cafeteria, and other parts of campus. McLaurin challenged the policies, saying they hurt his education. His fight made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in 1950. That decision struck a blow against segregation and helped set the stage for civil rights advances in education. 15. The discovery of Blanche Monnier. Blanche Monnier, a member of a prominent aristocratic family in Poitiers, France, was confined to a tiny dark room by her mother and brother for 26 years. She was finally discovered in 1901 when police found her after an anonymous tip led them to the house. By then, Blanche was middle-aged, dangerously thin, and living in horrific conditions. She hadn't seen sunlight for nearly 3 decades. According to reports at the time, her imprisonment was the result of her desire to marry someone her family didn't approve of. 14. Kidnapped by the Nazis. During World War II, the Nazis kidnapped an estimated 20,000 Polish children with Aryan features to assimilate them into German society. 8-year-old Zita Sus was one of them. Taken from an orphanage in Łódź, Poland in 1942, she was sent to a re-education center, and later to the Reichsschule für Volksdeutsche in Aachen, where speaking Polish was strictly forbidden. After the war, Zita returned to Poland, but was never reunited with her biological family. 13. A Japanese family returns home. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 led to the forced relocation and incarceration of around 120,000 Japanese Americans. Families were uprooted from their homes and sent to internment camps. 2/3 of those affected were U.S. citizens. By January 1945, the exclusion order was lifted and Japanese Americans were allowed to return home. But returning wasn't easy. Many found their homes vandalized, occupied, or sold, and hostility from neighbors was common. This photo, taken in May 1945, shows a Japanese family in Seattle returning to their house, only to find "No Japs Wanted" scrawled on the walls. 12. Into the Jaws of Death. On June 6, 1944, photographer Robert F. Sargent captured American soldiers disembarking from a landing craft at Omaha Beach during D-Day. The photo, titled "Taxis to Hell and Back, Into the Jaws of Death," shows soldiers wading through deadly waters toward the heavily defended shores of Normandy. The original caption actually described the danger best. Enemy fire will cut down some of them. Their taxi will pull itself off the sands and dash back for more passengers. D-Day claimed almost 10,000 Allied lives. A lot of the fallen were buried at the Normandy American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, but more than 1,500 soldiers' bodies were never recovered from the beaches nor the surrounding waters. 11. The liberation of Ebensee concentration camp. The Ebensee concentration camp was set up in 1943 as a sub-camp of Mauthausen to force prisoners to build underground tunnels for military use. Over 27,000 men passed through the camp, many of them Jewish, and the conditions were horrific. Prisoners were starved, overworked, and subjected to Nazi racial policies that treated some groups worse than others. When American forces finally liberated the camp on May 6, 1945, they found thousands of emaciated prisoners and unburied bodies. In spite of medical assistance, 750 prisoners died from starvation and disease shortly after their liberation. 10. A young girl's burden. The Korean War caused monumental devastation. Over 3 million people died, hundreds of thousands displaced, and millions were left grieving their loved ones. In many cases, children had to step into parental roles after losing their families. Taken on September 6, 1951, this photograph shows a young Korean girl carrying her brother on her back as she walks past a stalled M26 Pershing tank near Hangju. It shows the profound challenges endured by ordinary people in a war that tore families apart. 9. Otto revisits the secret annex. The man in this photo is Otto Frank, and Frank's father. He is standing alone in the attic of the secret annex in Amsterdam, where he and his family hid from the Nazis during World War II. Otto was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. Photographer Arnold Newman later described the emotional moment. As he photographed Otto, the bells of the Westertoren began to ring. Otto turned to Newman and said, "Those were the bells that Anne wrote about." Overcome with emotion, Otto broke down in tears, and Newman followed. It captured a moment of profound grief and continues to move people around the world. 8. Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz. The Auschwitz album is the only surviving visual record of the mass murder process at the infamous concentration camp. Likely taken by SS photographers Ernst Hoffmann or Bernhard Walter, the images captured Hungarian Jews, many from the Borevo ghetto, as they underwent selection on the camp's ramp. At the time the photos were taken, the deportation of Hungarian Jews was at its height. Those deemed fit to work were sent into the camp, while others, children, the elderly, and the sick, were sent straight to the gas chambers. The Auschwitz album documented the process leading up to the killings and was donated by Yad Vashem in 1980 by Lily Jacob Zelmanovich Meyer. 7. The Radium Girls. Have you ever heard of the Radium Girls? In the 1920s, these women worked in factories painting watch dials with glow-in-the-dark radium paint. They were told the paint was harmless, and were even instructed to point their brushes with their lips to create a fine tip. But the radium was poisoning them. They started suffering from illnesses like jaw necrosis, anemia, and bone cancer. And by 1927, 5 of the women filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Radium Corporation. The case was settled in 1928, with each woman receiving $10,000 and a $600 annual annuity for as long as they lived, along with coverage of medical and legal expenses. However, most of them didn't live long enough to see justice fully served. 6. The Captured Soldiers. In 1951, a group of Chinese soldiers knelt before a United Nations command soldier, terrified they were about to be executed. The looks on their faces say it all. At the time, Chinese forces, known as the People's Volunteer Army, had entered the war to support North Korea. Captured soldiers were sent to POW camps like the massive one on Koje Island. Life in these camps wasn't easy. Overcrowding, harsh conditions, and political indoctrination were the norm. The treatment and fate of these prisoners ultimately proved to be one of the biggest challenges of the armistice process. 5. Tereska and the Scars of War. In 1948, photographer David Seymour captured an unforgettable image of an 8-year-old girl named Tereska at a school for disturbed children in Warsaw. The assignment was simple: draw home. Tereska drew a chaotic tangle of lines. Tereska's trauma ran deep. At just 4 years old, her father was taken by the Gestapo, and she fled with her sister to their grandmother's house. The home was soon attacked, and during the chaos, Tereska was hit by shrapnel, which left her brain damaged. She and her sister wandered through the war zone for weeks before finding safety, but the psychological wounds never healed. Tereska spent the rest of her life in an asylum and passed away in 1978. 4. Smiles and Trauma of War. Back in the early days of photography, smiles weren't common. Poor dental health and the long exposure times needed for photos meant people usually kept their faces neutral. By the time World War I arrived, there was even less to smile about. Millions lost their lives, and those who survived often dealt with PTSD, severe injuries, or the grief of losing loved ones. In this 1916 photo from the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, a soldier seems to be smiling as medical orderlies tend to the wounded in a trench. But look closer. That smile is hollow. The soldier is shell-shocked, a term coined during the war to describe the devastating mental toll on soldiers. That smile isn't comforting. It's incredibly sad once you realize the truth. 3. The starvation of a Union soldier. This photo shows a Union soldier who barely survived Andersonville prison during the U.S. Civil War. The Confederate camp became infamous for its horrific conditions. While soldiers outside were fed, prisoners often starved. Even though this man was freed in May 1865, the pain captured in this photo is impossible to ignore. It's a terrible reminder of the cruel ways Americans dehumanized one another during the Civil War. 2. The shadows left behind in Hiroshima. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the intense heat from the blast burned shadows into nearby surfaces, capturing the outline of objects that had been there moments before. It happened with human victims too. Their silhouettes were seared into walls or steps, marking the spot where they stood or sat. This photo shows the haunting outline of a man who was sitting or walking on the stairs when the bomb struck. Can you imagine the power it takes to burn a human shadow into stone? 1. German soldiers watch footage of the Holocaust, 1945. While many Germans knew about the mass killings of Jewish people during the Holocaust, some were unaware of the full scope of the horrors in the concentration camps. By early 1945, approximately 1.1 million people had already been killed at Auschwitz alone. This photograph captured the raw reactions of German soldiers who were prisoners of war after being forced to watch footage of the concentration camps in 1945. I think it's safe to say that we're seeing shock and distress in response to the horrific reality they were confronted with. In that moment, the truth of their involvement could no longer be denied, and they were forced to confront the consequences of their role in the war. And that's it for today. I know, this list was not as cheerful and fun as some of the other ones we bring you, but nevertheless, it's an important one, even if it is painful. But before we wrap up, another trivia question for you. Of the Titanic's 1,517 victims, how many bodies were ultimately recovered? A, 250, B, 337, C, 450, or D, 500. I don't know if I want to say enjoyed today's content, and want to continue with more unbelievable historical photos, click this link right here. As always, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.